BSides DC would like to thank all of our sponsors, and a special thank you to all of our speakers, volunteers, and organizers for making 2018 a success.
Hello, everyone. I guess you'll be able to hear me. So I'm Dave Cafaro. I work at cybersecurity at Capital One, and I'm here to give a talk on what I like to call the Blue Team's next tool. It's leveraging social engineering. So same techniques and stuff that you might think of as a red team activity to get information out of someone, but also now leveraging it for potentially the good side and how you convince or help lead people to make good security decisions. I want to talk a little bit about me just to give you some background. Very technical geek, very much an introvert, but through all the work I've done, I've always had this interest in how humans, language, and people interact with their technology. Oops, sorry. So even when I was taking computer engineering and doing electronic circuits and computer programming, I also always made sure to take time to do classes like legal and social issues in computing or sociology, because I always felt that it was important to understand how people deal with computers and how people deal with technology. Because if we don't kind of look at that aspect of it, we're always going to fail at how we develop technology. And now we've got UX developers and we've got a lot of specialists that are looking at how we can make the technology work for them, but we also need to do a lot more of that in the security space as well. And one aspect of that is, actually talking and working with teams to get them to do security things. So I want to talk a little bit about how attackers use social engineering. We know that attackers use social engineering to manipulate how people respond to things. They look at how can they talk someone into divulging a piece of information, or how can they craft an email that convinces someone to click on a link they shouldn't link. Social engineering is really just another aspect of sales. So when you're looking at these social engineers, they're not doing stuff that hasn't been being done for a long time. We have a new cool term for it, social engineering, but we've been doing social engineering for pretty much as long as humans have interacted with each other. And it's just a matter of how you use those exact same tools that Red Team is now leveraging for doing tests against your malicious actors or using to gain access to your systems. But it's all about how you interact with those people, and really, if you want to get down to it, how do you sell something to these people. So if you find a really good salesperson, that's a great person to learn from for social engineering, because they're going to use the exact same kind of tools and techniques I'm going to talk about in this talk. They just kind of either naturally came across it, or as they've learned how to make that sale, how to talk someone to buying something that they didn't necessarily need, or even finding out what that person needs to buy so that they are a happier person and come back again later. These are all just social engineering techniques that have just been leveraged in a different way. Instead of being leveraged as an attacker, they may be leveraging them for defense. It's all about breaking down those barriers. Adversaries, it's all about gaining false trust. For a defender, it's about gaining true trust. So the idea is that you're trying to make these people understand that you are trying to help them. So if you're a blue team and you're trying to get teams to patch something, or you're trying to get teams to make that choice that maybe is a more expensive solution or a more expensive path to take, or requires delaying the gratification of making this big win, you need to get them to trust you. Just the same way as an attacker needs to figure out a way to get you to trust their email, or trust them walking in the door with you, or trust that whatever they're telling you over the phone to gain access to your, could you reset my account or something. It's all about figuring out a way to gain that trust with those people. So when you're looking at this, it's, again, the defensive side, it's the exact same techniques that we're going to use for gaining unauthorized access to gain that authorized access with people. It's all about working through, finding out what they know, what they need, what relations you have with them, how to leverage those relations. And part of that, and this is one of the kind of fundamental building blocks, and you see this both in attacker social engineering or red team social engineering, is learning how to interact with micro-societies within organizations. So one of the things you need to do when you're trying to work with, trying to interact with another team. So in my role, I'm primarily a security consultant within our company. So a lot of the time I have to go out there and try to interact with varying technical teams or maybe business teams, or it can be a range of different levels of technology versus business knowledge. If I just walk into those not knowing what I'm walking into, I'm going to be an outsider. I'm not going to speak their language. I'm not going to know their terms. I'm not going to be one of them. So I've already lost some of the trust with them. So going back to that building the trust, before you interact with these people, you have to understand that they've formed micro-societies. So this might be looking at what terms do they use within their group. Are there technical terms they use? Are there shorthand terms that they use? When you look at like a malicious social engineer, for example, if you read up on some like Kevin Mitnick's stuff, when he was attacking phone companies, he spent a lot of time learning what was the language the phone company reps used, what were the terms that they used to, if they needed to get a phone number, did they say, hey, I need a phone number, or did they say, hey, I need the digit of this relay station or something like that? He learned the language that they used within their group. When you're blue team and you're going out and trying to interact with other organizations or other groups within your organization, you need to do the same thing. You need to learn these other languages that they use. Because when you establish that common language with them, you become more trustworthy. You're not just someone walking in there going, hey, do this. You're walking in and saying, hey, you know that so-and-so of yours? Yeah, we need to do this to it so that it accomplishes this, and it's all spoken in the language that they understand. And it seems really simple, and it seems that's something very basic, but that is social engineering. That is one of those first steps of it, is learning the terminology and the language of your target so that you can become part of that group. You can join that micro-society, and you become more trustworthy. So this goes into more of the know your audience and understand the target. Anytime a red team organization is going, or red team, or I say red team a lot because we have a lot of red teamers and they're kind of friends of mine, but this really is the same thing as the malicious attackers who are using social engineering. Before they even start an operation against someone, they're going to go in and they're going to do lots of research. They want to find out everything. So it's not just the language that they're doing so that they're more like the micro-society they're trying to get into, but they're using things like they're trying to find out all the different tools they use, they're trying to find out their org structure, they're trying to find out, even to the point of where they go on vacation and what kind of side things what are their hobbies. They want to know every little bit because all of that information helps give them more leverage whenever they start interacting with these people. Knowing what they do, who they are, and why they do it are important aspects of when we want to try to do our blue team social engineering. It's the same thing. It's knowing all these little aspects so that when you get into conversations with them, and I'll talk a little bit about another kind of tool that leverages some of this information, but when you go in there and you have 5 minutes before a meeting starts, there's small talk. That small talk runs more smoothly when you know stuff about them. And you can talk to them, and you start doing things that I'm going to talk about later, like preloading and framing the conversation, where you're setting up before you even really get into the meat of the discussion. Again, you're setting up for success by getting into the heads, more or less, of these individuals in a way that they become comfortable with it. So one of the kind of more psychological type things is we look at what's called communication modeling. So again, this is more the prep work that you do beforehand. It's taking a look at the very components of how you are communicating with the people you're going to communicate. And it doesn't matter whether this is via email or a presentation or you're meeting, an in-person discussion or a phone call. These components always are consistent in all of them. You have a source or a sender, i.e. you. You have a channel, how it's being communicated, the message, what is being communicated, the receiver, the person that you want to send this to or make them receive the message, and feedback, i.e. what is the result after these people receive that message. Each one of these play on the other and play an important part of how you're going to be communicating with them. When you're prepping for a meeting or you are preparing to even craft an email to ask of something, you can use this model to kind of build out a more successful communication. So you can start by looking at your feedback, which really you can think of it as what is the goal? What are you trying to get that person to do? What do you want them to do? So you start off thinking, okay, this is what my goal is. Who am I sending this to? So is this going to a VP or is this going to a sysadmin? Thinking of who that language is going to have to speak to. Then figuring out the message based on who that's going to. So is it going to be a very technical message? Is it going to be a more high-level message? The channel. Figuring out how an individual best communicates. So this isn't how you necessarily best communicate with someone, but how someone else best communicates. So sending an email to someone who never checks their email is not going to do you much good. But if they love doing text messages and sending them a carefully crafted text message is going to set you up for a much higher chance of success. So understanding what channel you are going to use is going to be very important. And then of course, the source sender. It's making sure that you are representing what you want to be represented. If you want to be representing yourself as a technical person, make sure you understand that technical side of it. If you are representing at a higher level, make sure you understand that. You don't want to false representation. Unlike red team attackers or malicious attackers, as a blue teamer, we don't get the option of doing our attack and then never having to deal with that person ever again. You are going to have to most likely talk to that person again. So we never want to do something that is going to set us up for future failure. We don't get to lie. We don't get to fib. We have to stick to the facts. We have to represent ourselves accurately. So making sure that you, as a source or sender, are accurately representing your capabilities is very important. And this is more not just for success for this initial communication, but also making sure that you haven't handicapped yourself at later communications. So another tool that's available to us is elicitation. This is all about how we get information from people. This is about being natural and informed. So when you go into a conversation, you don't want to seem like you are trying to get something. You want to be someone who's trying to work with them, or you want to have a relaxed, this is all part of us all working together. You don't want to just walk in and go, hey, we got to do this, you don't have any choice, let's get it done now. Even if they are required to do something, you start a conversation like that and they will find ways to slow down the entire process. So in the end, you may get what you want, but it may not be when you want. And again, you've probably already set yourself up for future problems as you've already kind of framed your future interaction with them in a negative light. So being natural and informed helps you walk in confident, but not in a forceful kind of way. Preloading, which I kind of talked about a little bit earlier, is how do you get them prepared for those conversations a little earlier? So maybe you know that you're going to be having a meeting later on with these individuals on some request for some kind of, they need to deploy a new tool because the current tool they have has an exploit in it, so you know it's going to be a lot of work on them. So beforehand, earlier in that day, you might reach out and say, hey, how many systems do you think something like this is going to affect? What are your current loads? Like, what are you currently working on? You start getting them thinking about what the work is without actually making the request of the work. Like, how can you basically smooth that later conversation by already getting them in that pre-position of doing the work? It's like, okay, they've already started thinking about doing this work. They already know they're going to, these are the things they're going to have to do. And now you also, because of these conversations, have gathered additional intel on your target that you can then apply when you're having those discussions later on with them and have that face-to-face meeting. So you're not going into a blind meeting. You're going into it with the target already preloaded, thinking about the issues, as well as already having gathered information to help feed your own conversation with them. And then there's managed questions. So this is the idea of how you best used open-ended, closed-ended, leading and assumptive questions. So when you go in there, if you don't know necessarily what you're trying to find out, you want to leverage open-ended questions. So these are questions that leave the individual a lot of room to kind of ramble their answer to you in the hopes that you may gather more additional information. You can then follow up those open-ended questions with what's a closed-ended question, which is something where you ask for a very specific, you're asking to get a very specific answer. You have an idea of what you want, and you're going to ask them a question that doesn't give them a lot of leeway about how they answer it. Leading and assumptive questions are very similar, where we kind of already know what the answer is, but we want to confirm the answer. So we kind of lead them to the answer that we're waiting to hear from them, and it helps us verify information that we believe we have. Again, these are all techniques that, if you're a malicious actor, you're going to be using these questions to help gather your intel and your information, and hopefully work through, getting whatever additional access that you need that you don't necessarily normally have. But we can use them, again, from a blue team perspective of leading through the process of getting people to do what they may not necessarily normally want to do. They may know that they need to do it, but this will at least make them more confident in what you're asking them to do. So then we get into a few more psychological discussions. So the ideas of modes of thinking and the senses. So modes of thinking is very closely tied to the senses of humans. So we've got sight, hearing, touch, smell, taste. Two of those senses, sight and hearing, are very important when we talk about modes of thinking, of how people think about stuff. For example, so a visual thinker is someone who likes to have an image in their head, or when they see something, that reminds them of something later on. This might be someone that when you're in a conversation and they go, hey, I see what you mean, or yeah, I got a picture of what you're trying to describe. They're going to use words, and they're going to use memory techniques that are associated with visual clues. You have then the hearing or the auditory thinkers, who are going to be the people who kind of say, when you tell them something, they'll say, I hear what you are saying, or does this sound clear to you? These are people who are going to associate different thoughts and memories with what they're hearing and what their ears are helping them process. And then you've got kind of a mismatch of those other senses, that touch, smell, taste, and also you can think of it as like brain, the kinesthetic or feeling mode of thinking. These are people who they associate some kind of touch or emotion or something tangible with their mode of thinking. So they might say, do you feel this works? They might be someone who, when they're in conversations, they'll give you a tap on your arm going, do you understand this, or do you get this? Their way of interacting and thinking of things is to attach a feel to it. Now, these are important because when you're interacting with people, people are going to fall into these categories. And if you want to be more successful in how you're having that conversation with them or how you're communicating with them, you want to understand what mode of thinking that individual is. Now, part of figuring that out is listening to how they talk. So again, when you're kind of going into a meeting and it's a little bit early, you might be able to have some conversations with them. Again, you've done some background research on them, so you already know some of the things that they're already dealing with within their division or their office. So you might say, talk about, oh yeah, I've heard you've had some challenges rolling this out, talk a little bit on that, kind of, buddy-buddy kind of conversations, listening to how they describe the situation they're dealing with. Are they saying, yeah, we're just not feeling this is rolling out correctly, or we've had a really hard time trying to visualize the architecture of this. You can listen for those keywords. And then once you kind of have a better idea of whether they are a visual or auditory or a feeling thinker, you can then tailor your mode of communication. So if you walked in with a whole bunch of slides that have lots and lots of pictures, but you're talking to someone who's an auditory thinker, you don't want to dwell on the pictures as much as you want to dwell on what you are describing to them and how you're talking to them, and have those interactive conversations, because those interactive conversations are things that are going to stick in their head. They'll think about later. The same thing with a feeling person is you're going to have to figure out how to make it more interactive with them. How do you bring them out? It's a little bit more difficult, at least for me, when dealing with feeling type people, because I'm always, being an introvert, I tend not to like touching people that much or really kind of getting in people's close space. But you can work with things that are tactile for them. So if you have even something as simple as a piece of paper that they can hand around and touch and hold, that becomes a physical object that is now a feeling that they've seen. So the picture that may be on that now becomes a physical object to them because they have felt it with their hands. They've had an individual interaction with that. You can often see kind of those feeling people because they're the ones that will almost always print out stuff because they work better with paper, because they have something physical in their hand that they're flipping through, and it helps it stick in their head. So figuring out how people think is very important. And you leverage those other tools that we talked about already to stack onto that so that you get your preloading and you have those early conversations and you start understanding how they think so that you can then create material thinking about your goals and your feedback and your channel and your message so that you can then tailor it to the way that they think, the way that they interact, their technical level, their structural levels. All of these little tools that we're talking through all kind of start stacking and building on each other. And it's all about how we tailor our communication to get the reaction out of the people that we're interacting with. They may normally have been a little bit more reserved coming up to talk about security because they know, oh, security is a blocker, they're going to cause me problems, they're going to ask me to do a whole bunch of stuff I don't want to do. We want to avoid that and leverage these tools so that we can work around that. We start having those conversations at their level. We start talking about the things they are interested in. And that way, we're no longer necessarily those outsiders. We've joined that micro-society. We're now communicating in the way that they best understand in their brain. We've now figured out how to work around that blockage so that they're not looking at us as that outsider. Another part of this is framing the conversations. So we go back to talking about the people who enter, when you first go into the meeting, you need to kind of figure out ways to start the meeting off in a positive light, as well as how you communicate things so that they come out as a positive light. So if you go, a great example of framing would be something like, if you walk into a conversation and go, 25% of your systems are unpatched and this is not going to work and we're going to have a lot of problems and you got to get on this, you're not doing good, 25%, this is unacceptable. You've already set yourself up as an adversary to them. But using the other side of those numbers, all right, you've accomplished 75% patching. We're on a good start. But we got to get to the rest of the thing. We've got to work together and figure out how to get those remaining 25%. If you focus and start on that 75%, on that good number, that number that gives them a positive feeling, you've framed up a positive conversation. You've got them in a position where they're more likely to want to work with you because they're thinking positive versus negative. There's a couple of different kind of standard tools that they discuss and when we're talking about framing. There's bridging, which is really linking kind of unrelated items. There's amplification, where you kind of focus on people's beliefs and their understandings. There's extension, which is kind of expanding the scope of whatever your conversation is. And transformation, which is usually involved when we have to kind of rethink how we are trying to have that conversation. But the one I really wanted to focus on was more the frame extension, because that's the one, at least for myself, I found is most helpful in kind of the blue team area. And it's where if I go into a conversation and I'm very focused on one specific thing, the people I'm working with are dealing with a lot of other things. And they start losing focus of what does this really have to do with everything else I've got to do. So what I like to do is take that framing extension technique, which is the idea of I start pulling in other stuff. It's like, we're dealing with this, but this impacts this. Oh, and I know you've got this business process over here. By the way, if we do this, that's going to improve, or we're going to be in a better position for that. Later on, I know that in a month's time or 2 months' time, we were planning on leveraging this technology. Well, we're going to have to do this for that anyway. So if we take care of that now, we've now set up to a lower amount of work later on. So using framing extension, I make sure that whatever I'm asking that individual to do is more relevant to all of their work and not just this one ask that I'm doing. That gets them off the focus of just this one thing so that they kind of start thinking about all the different areas that this might actually tie in and help them out in the overall process. And all of these things come to developing empathy and trust. I found this one, I just love this. It's knowing exactly how you feel. When you walk into a meeting with people and you start speaking their language, talking about the stuff, like, I found that like some people, it's great just to gripe at the beginning of the meeting with them about the stuff that sucks. Because they start understanding, oh, you're dealing with a lot of junk too. That starts setting up trust. They understand that you are not just this mechanical security person coming in to beat them down. You're this person who's dealing with a lot of stupid stuff like them. And we're trying to make the best job we can and get the best results for whoever we work or whatever project we're on. It's getting that kind of bonding moment with them of, I feel your pain. Let's try to make this as painless as possible. That common connections, looking for frustrations that you all share, looking for the success that you all share. These are all things that we can help pull in and tie in to help bridge that gap that often happens when we as security professionals try to go in and start working with individuals and getting them to do the right thing. Offering to help and showing the value that you provide to them is all part of this process. You know, always asking what they can give you is not going to be successful in the long term. They are going to get tired of your constant ask for stuff. You may still have to do it, but you have to find a better way to do it. So how do we deliver those requests? One thing that an attacker will do is they'll go into a conversation about what they're trying to provide to the other person. So before they even start asking about what they need, they might go in going, hey, I heard you were having trouble with this. Is there something I can help you with? Or I'm from this division and I was trying to help out this other person on your team. I know they're out on vacation right now. You know, I was trying to do this for them, but I've run into this issue. They lead with what they're trying to help that other group. We can do the same thing. We're trying to help them improve security. We're trying to help them avoid having, to show up on, the New York Times later on in the year. We're trying to make sure that they are set up so that, they're not having to explain why all the systems went down because they forgot to patch something and someone, exploited an easy takedown, a denial of service attack. We are trying to help them, so leading with stuff that we are offering to do for them helps start that conversation in a positive light. So this is all about going in saying, hey, I've been kind of going through, I wanted to, kind of sum up some materials for you. I know that you've been dealing with a lot of requests coming in from a whole bunch of different people. I've kind of had some conversations with them, and I think we can streamline this, and this should make it a lot easier for you. Maybe you won't have to deal with as much stuff. Look at ways that you can go into a conversation beforehand with things already kind of eased for them before you make the ask. You're going to need to make the ask because they're going to need to do whatever it is that's the problem, whether it's some configuration change or a security issue or whatever that in your particular area is. You're going to need to make that ask, but you've started off with offering them something. So you make that ask. And then after you've made that ask and you've had that conversation of what they need to do, and you've had the conversation of previously about what you're doing for them, end on something that leaves them with a good feeling. i.e., maybe it's as easy as cycling back to what you had been offering to do with them and going over what you provided to them and how that ties into what they're going to provide for you. Or maybe it's just ending on some kind of really fun thing you all were talking about before, but don't leave the meeting or leave the conversation or end the email simply with, do this. Because all they remember is, this person asked me to do something again. End with something that kind of ties back to, hey, and remember I'll take care of that other thing for you. Or, hey, be sure to, I'll be sure to send you that information about that, new toy I was playing with, the cool electronics thing. Or whatever other conversation. Or maybe it's just simply as, thank you very much. I look forward to chatting with you the next time. I'll be sure to give you an update on, where something happened. Again, you've left with something you're going to do for them. It's not just what you've asked them to do for you. It's all about kind of framing that conversation around being a team, working together, providing things that help them so that they can help you, and keeping that positive note at the end of the conversation. And again, it doesn't have to be, this is something that applies to both an email or a text message or a presentation or any kind of one of those channels of communication can all be kind of framed in the same way and how we discuss those things. Leveraging the model of thinking that we've developed for that individual, the background knowledge, the research that we found out about our target, knowing our target, knowing what that target cares about, knowing what that target's working on, knowing the language of that target, building up this full profile, building up the communication, knowing the goal that we want to get, knowing how that will come back, knowing the message, knowing how we represent ourselves as that sender of that message, building that all into a consistent story that keeps them engaged and working with us and more interested in being part of our team as we are part of their team, working through figuring out the security issues that we've got to deal with. Going kind of way back to the beginning, this all ties in with understanding that relation between technology, security, and humanity that I've always been interested in. I love watching or reading up on how social engineers have manipulated people, because I hear those conversations and I see those actions, and I always see how they've just leveraged kind of these standard sales tactics or standard sociology, like all these things that have been studied for a long time to accomplish, fit so closely in with everything I have to do on a day-to-day basis, talking to individuals out there and figuring out how I can convince them that this needs to be a priority for them. So I try to leverage these tools to enable that connection between technology and people, as well as work through kind of the preconceived notions that a lot of the teams may have about the security person coming in. I think it's something that we could probably do a lot better in Blue Team. I think there's a lot of focus on how we do technology and all the tools that we deploy and how we deploy those tools and how our new CASB is going to protect us in the cloud and how our new firewall will keep people out. But we always are missing how we're doing that interaction with the individuals that we're day-to-day working with these technologies. And if we use our communication skills, and then we use these tools that are really well documented, and there's some great books out there that talk about this in a lot more detail than I have time to do in this talk, we can be more successful about understanding that human interaction with the technology so that we can better improve security as a whole. So I have some time. I did want to put up a couple of slides up here, or links up here. So there's two real big books on social engineering. The Art of Deception by Mitnick and Simon, and Social Engineering, the Art of Human Hacking by Christopher Hagney. These are great books, but they are very different books. The Art of Deception is a great book if you want to see examples and read through a story of how someone has manipulated it. I've actually called out a couple of chapters I thought were very relevant to a Blue Team, where you can read through the story and kind of have an idea of how that might actually work if you were trying to leverage it to get someone to do something in a positive light and not just manipulating them to steal something. But he's a great storyteller. He does a great job of talking through a scenario and helping you understand what he was doing and why he was doing it, and how it elicited the response he got from his target. The Social Engineering, the Art of Human Hacking, is a lot more of a technical book. So a lot of the psychological tools and sociological tools I talked about in this, he goes into a lot of detail on. He also covers a lot of other things that I just don't have the time. Like, there's a lot to be known about micro expressions on people's faces. So trying to learn to read people's faces and how they're reacting to the stuff you are saying and doing. He has a great chapter on all those kind of things, and this is something that gamblers actually use a lot as well. How they're trying to get tells from individuals and understand where their cards may be lying. But there's no way I can talk in detail on that. Again, that book is a great book for a lot of very detailed discussion of the techniques that I've kind of done a very high level gloss over, really.
The Power of Introverts. This is another good book. I liked it because I have this big interest, again, in humanities and sociology, and being an introvert, I always like to try to figure out how I can go beyond like my little quiet world, such as volunteering to do presentations. But it also tells you a lot about how people, as extroverts and introverts, interact with the outside world. And it can help give you insight on how you deal with introverts or extroverts differently, because they react to different things in different ways. Introverts don't like being yelled at. They don't necessarily like being overwhelmed with stimulus. They work better with slower, clear, calm communication. Where an extrovert wants to be really engaged and really in there and wants a lot of exciting stuff all happening. If you reverse those communications with those individuals, it's not going to go well. They're either going to gloss out or panic. And I found that that book actually gave me a lot better insight into some of the ways I can interact, not just how I as an introvert interact with other people, but also how I can better interact with extroverts and how I can better interact with other introverts. It's a long book, but it was a great, I read it in a weekend because it was so good. Communication theory, again, talks a little bit more about the modes of communication. Professor out at Wayne State University. He actually was the great little picture I had of all the people talking and looping together. Jack Haig is a red team social engineer on Twitter. She has some great walkthroughs of her actual attacks on organizations. Highly recommend reading through those and just listening to some of the stuff that she's talking about. Again, you take a look at that with the understanding of some of the things I've discussed in this presentation, you can see the techniques being played out and kind of understand how you might take that into your blue team scenario to convince other people to do things. Not in a sense of lying to them, but in a sense of gaining their trust, that true trust with them. And then Timothy DeBlock actually had another talk almost titled the exact same. I actually changed the title of mine because I didn't want to be exactly the same as his. But he actually talks more about presentation. So there's all these communication models I'm talking about, but there's also about how you look and how you interact with people as a person. And he does a great job of kind of talking about presenting yourself, making yourself fit in with those groups that you're going to be talking with. I thought it was a very interesting talk, so I wanted to call that out. So that's it. Hopefully that was all helpful to you. I do want to make a small call out. So Capital One and Critical Stack are both here, and we're hiring a lot of people. So I'd love to get some more coworkers. Katie actually up here in the front, she's hanging out at the place. Talk to her. We are hiring. And at this point, I'd just like to open it up for questions. Any questions? Yeah. So it is not easy to pick up. It takes a lot of research and understanding and certainly a lot of practice. So with my teams, a lot of it is a lot of our communications through email or other electronics means, just because we're dealing with so many people. And what I'll do with certainly people who report direct to me is I'll work through, like I'll say, hey, craft up an email that you need to send out and share it with me first. And let's walk through about what you're doing, how you're doing it. And I'll point out, hey, don't lead with this. Let's lead with something that maybe makes them more comfortable. And, oh, I noticed you just kind of like ended it right here saying, do this for me. Well, why don't we kind of end it with this kind of a soft landing at the end? So really kind of working through my directs is like, how are they communicating, kind of showing them how I would craft it, showing them why. So it's not just a matter of me going in and going, oh, I don't like what you wrote, write it this way. It's, oh, okay, you know, I think you got the core stuff here, but let's kind of work on how we do this, because we want them to be thinking about this when they start reading this first paragraph. And you've got the delivery of the technical request really great, but let's finish up with, you know, kind of discussing with them this other thing so that they're not thinking just on that, but thinking of the broader scope of it. But making sure that it's not just me rewriting their communication, but explaining why we are making changes and what the actual reason for that change is. Right, and they, yeah, they've done it a couple of times. They start understanding why they're doing it that way, and it gets more natural to them. Because without practice, without working through this, you're just knowing the technical bits of it. Again, we're dealing with humans. It's not like technology. It's not a simple off or on bit. Humans have all these little sub-gray areas in between all those off and on bits that we have to kind of work through and start understanding, because all the people that we're communicating with are all different. So every time we think we've come up with one model of communication, we have to develop another model of communication, because that person is a visual thinker, that person's an auditory thinker, that person has a team of Linux experts, this team has a team of business analysts. They're not going to be the same communication, and we have to figure out through time and repetition about what the right way is. It's more difficult, but phrasing the language that you use in those in an auditory or visual way. So if you're talking to a visual person on email, now understand that reading text is not necessarily the same thing as visual, but describing pictures to them so they start creating the visual image in their head is a way of starting to use visual communication with a visual thinker. Creating that picture, letting them have the information that helps create that. If it's auditory, again, it's a little bit more difficult. It's if you can't get them on the phone or get them in an in-person communication, you have to think about how you might tie it into auditory language, i.e., do you hear, you know, again, kind of going to that language, do you hear what I'm trying to explain, or see if you can't get them to a phone call point of view at some point, or opportunity. Luckily, the vast majority of people are actually visual type people. I'm going to throw out unsustained statistics, but I've heard somewhere like 65% of people are visual, something like 25% are auditory, and the rest are kind of the thinking feeling. Unfortunately, I don't have good site to source for that. But I have consistently read that people tend to be more visual, so usually that's kind of the first route you go. But it certainly does, you know, when we're talking about communication paths that don't have audio attached or don't have physical objects attached to it, it becomes a lot more difficult to kind of figure out how to do the language to talk to someone who's more auditory. And again, trying to think of things in the language that you're using that brings up hearing type connections for that individual. Usually probably the best that I get away with is just how do I get them thinking about sounds related to it. You know, we don't want, you know, like we're trying to, you know, patch something and we don't want the scanner to start sending off alarm bells or something like that. I've added an auditory concept to the conversation, but it's all in text. Any other questions? What's that? So, yeah. So I don't think of it as playing stupid as playing to their ego. So yes, there can be benefit of playing up to someone's ego because it gets them in a position where they think, oh, I know more, I need to help this person, or I'm superior and I've got to educate them. You have to be careful with that because sometimes they can go a little bit too much, but if you're willing to filter out the too much, you certainly can play that. And I've done that before. I've let someone be the expert even though I already knew all the stuff they were talking about because I still needed them to get that done, and this made them more comfortable. Yeah, so playing the ego or playing stupid, depending on which side you want to, if you want to frame it in a positive sense versus negative. Anything else? Okay. I think this is about when it's supposed to end, but right, thank you. Thank you very much.